The evidence Jasmine Crockett presented didn't just destroy Clarence Thomas. It revealed a network of corruption involving 3 Supreme Court justices, 12 senators, and over $50 million in unreported influence money. America would never trust the court the same way again. What started as a routine investigation into judicial ethics became the largest corruption scandal in Supreme Court history, and it all began with one congresswoman who refused to believe that anyone, no matter how powerful, was above the law. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started with a yacht. Not just any yacht, but a 162-foot luxury vessel called the Harlan's Dream, worth approximately $15 million, anchored in the crystal-clear waters off Martha's Vineyard on a perfect September morning. The boat belonged to Harlan Crow, a Dallas real estate billionaire, whose net worth exceeded $2 billion, and whose influence in conservative political circles was matched only by his desire to stay out of the public spotlight. Representative Jasmine Crockett had stumbled upon the first photograph almost by accident. She was researching campaign finance violations for a different case when she came across a social media post from a luxury travel blogger who had been documenting elite vacation spots. The image showed several distinguished older men relaxing on the yacht's deck, drinks in hand, laughing at some shared joke. The photo was tagged with a location and date, but what caught Jasmine's attention wasn't the opulent setting. It was one of the faces in the background. Justice Clarence Thomas, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, was unmistakably visible in the photograph, wearing casual clothes and appearing completely relaxed among what were clearly wealthy private citizens. The date stamp showed the photo had been taken during a week when the court was supposed to be in recess, but Thomas had not disclosed this trip on any of his required financial disclosure forms. That photograph became the first piece of what would eventually become a puzzle so large and complex that it would shake American democracy to its core. But at the time, Jasmine saw it as nothing more than a potential ethics violation, serious, but hardly unprecedented. Supreme Court justices had been taking undisclosed gifts and trips for years, with minimal consequences beyond the occasional slap on the wrist. What she didn't know was that this single photograph would lead her into the darkest corners of American political corruption, where Supreme Court decisions were influenced by private payments, where senators sold their votes to the highest bidder, and where a network of billionaires had essentially purchased their own private justice system. Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of person to let sleeping dogs lie. At 44, the former prosecutor had built her career on following evidence wherever it led, regardless of how powerful the people it implicated. She had taken on police corruption in Dallas, exposed city council bribery schemes, and prosecuted white-collar criminals who thought their wealth and connections made them untouchable. When she was elected to Congress, she brought that same relentless pursuit of truth with her. Her office in the Rayburn House office building was a study in organized chaos. Law books lined every available shelf, file folders created precarious towers on every surface, and 3 different computer monitors displayed spreadsheets, legal documents, and news articles. Her staff had learned to navigate around the organized chaos, understanding that every seemingly random document was actually part of a larger investigation that existed primarily in their boss's razor-sharp mind. The yacht photograph went into a new file folder labeled Thomas Ethics Preliminary. Within 48 hours, that folder had grown to include flight records showing Justice Thomas had traveled to Martha's Vineyard on a private jet registered to one of Crow's shell companies. Within a week, it contained property records showing that Thomas's mother lived in a house that Crow had purchased and was allowing her to use rent-free. Within a month, the folder had become 3 folders, then a file cabinet, then an entire section of Jasmine's office devoted to what was becoming the most complex corruption investigation in modern American history. But it wasn't just Clarence Thomas. The more Jasmine dug, the more connections she found. Justice Samuel Alito had taken fishing trips to Alaska, all expenses paid by wealthy donors who had cases before the court. Justice Neil Gorsuch had sold property to a law firm that regularly appeared before the Supreme Court, and the network extended far beyond the court itself. Senator Graham had received speaking fees, that coincidentally matched his votes on judicial nominations. Senator Cruz had taken family vacations that were paid for by donors, who later received favorable treatment in congressional hearings. The pattern was so clear and so extensive that Jasmine began to suspect she wasn't looking at isolated incidents of corruption. She was looking at a systematic purchase of the American justice system. 3 months into her investigation, Jasmine had assembled a team of forensic accountants, investigative journalists, and legal experts who worked out of a secure office space she had rented privately, away from the Capitol and the prying eyes of those who might want to stop her work. The team worked in shifts around the clock, following money trails that crisscrossed international borders and disappeared into a maze of shell companies, charitable foundations, and private trusts. The scope of what they were uncovering was breathtaking. The Crow Network alone had funneled over $38 million to Supreme Court justices, federal judges, senators, and congressional representatives over the past 15 years. But Crow was just one node in a much larger network. Other billionaires, Leonard Leo, Paul Singer, Charles Koch, had their own networks of influence, their own methods of purchasing favorable decisions, their own systems for ensuring that American justice served their interests rather than the public's. The breakthrough came when Jasmine's team managed to obtain banking records from a whistleblower inside one of the private banks that catered exclusively to ultra, high-net-worth individuals. The records showed a pattern of payments that perfectly correlated with major Supreme Court decisions. 2 weeks before the court ruled on a case involving environmental regulations, Justice Thomas received a $50,000 consulting fee from a company owned by oil industry executives. 1 month before a crucial voting rights decision, Justice Alito's wife received a $75,000 speaking engagement from a group funded by conservative donors. The pattern was so consistent and so extensive that it couldn't be explained by coincidence. These weren't gifts between friends or innocent networking opportunities. This was a systematic corruption of the American justice system, operating at the highest levels of government with the kind of sophisticated money laundering techniques usually associated with international crime syndicates. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. As Jasmine's team traced the financial networks deeper, they uncovered evidence of coordination between the Supreme Court corruption and similar schemes targeting senators and representatives. The same billionaires who were purchasing Supreme Court decisions were also buying congressional votes, ensuring that their influence extended across all 3 branches of government. The evidence was overwhelming, but Jasmine knew that having evidence and being able to present it effectively were 2 different things. She needed more than bank records and financial documents. She needed something that would capture the public's attention and make the corruption impossible to ignore or dismiss. That's when she decided to set a trap. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jasmine would leak selective information about her investigation to see how the corruption network would respond. If they were truly innocent, they would cooperate with the investigation and provide explanations for the suspicious financial activities. But if they were guilty, they would try to cover their tracks, and in doing so, they would provide even more evidence of their corruption. Working through trusted intermediaries, Jasmine arranged for stories to appear in several major newspapers, suggesting that congressional investigators were looking into Supreme Court ethics violations. The stories were carefully crafted to suggest that the investigation was in its preliminary stages and focused on relatively minor infractions, unreported gifts, failure to recuse from cases involving donors, standard ethics violations that typically resulted in little more than public embarrassment. The response was immediate and exactly what Jasmine had hoped for. Within 24 hours of the first story appearing, the financial records showed a flurry of activity. Money began moving between accounts at unprecedented speed. Shell companies were dissolved and new ones created. Expensive gifts were quietly returned to their purchasers. Private jets that had been used for undisclosed trips were suddenly sold to new owners in other countries. But most importantly, the targets of the investigation began communicating with each other in ways that revealed the true scope of their network. Phone records obtained through legal warrants showed Justice Thomas calling Senator Graham within hours of the first news story. Banking records showed Harlan Crow transferring money to accounts linked to other Supreme Court justices. The pattern of communications revealed a network that extended far beyond what even Jasmine had suspected. The trap had worked perfectly. In their panic to cover their tracks, the corrupt officials had provided a roadmap of their entire operation. But now came the most dangerous part of the investigation. Jasmine had enough evidence to destroy some of the most powerful people in America, and those people were not going to go down without a fight. The first sign that Jasmine's investigation had been discovered came in the form of a phone call from the House Ethics Committee. Chairman Williams, a longtime congressman who had built his career on avoiding controversy, asked Jasmine to come to his office for what he described as an informal conversation about some concerns that have been raised. Jasmine knew immediately what this was about. The corruption network had discovered her investigation and was using their influence to shut it down through official channels. She arrived at Williams's office prepared for a battle, bringing with her a summary of the evidence she had gathered and a legal opinion from constitutional scholars supporting her right to conduct the investigation. Williams was not alone. With him were two other members of the Ethics Committee, both of whom had received substantial campaign contributions from donors connected to the corruption network. Also present were lawyers from the House Counsel's office and a representative from the Justice Department who claimed to be there in an advisory capacity. Congresswoman Crockett, Williams began, his voice carrying the tone of disappointed authority. It has come to our attention that you have been conducting unauthorized investigations into sitting members of the judiciary. This raises serious concerns about separation of powers and congressional overreach. Jasmine had expected this argument and was ready for it. Chairman Williams, Congress has clear constitutional authority to investigate potential corruption in all branches of government, including the judiciary. The evidence I have gathered suggests systematic violations of federal ethics laws that require congressional oversight. What you call evidence, others might call politically motivated fishing expedition, replied one of the other committee members. You're targeting conservative justices and Republican senators based on nothing more than gossip and speculation. This was the moment Jasmine had been preparing for. She opened her portfolio and placed a single document on the table. A bank record showing a $100,000 payment from Harlan Crow to an account controlled by Justice Thomas, made just 2 days before the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case involving Crow's business interests. This is not gossip, she said calmly. This is a documented financial transaction between a Supreme Court justice and a party who had direct financial interests in cases before the court. And this is just one example of hundreds of similar transactions I have documented. The room fell silent. The lawyers exchanged glances. Williams cleared his throat and shuffled his papers uncomfortably. Even if these allegations have merit, Williams finally said, the proper venue for such investigations would be the Justice Department, not Congress. The Justice Department has known about these issues for years and has chosen not to act, Jasmine replied. Congress has a constitutional duty to provide oversight when other institutions fail in their responsibilities. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome was predetermined. The corruption network had enough influence within the House leadership to limit Jasmine's investigation, but they couldn't stop it entirely without raising suspicions. Instead, they would try to contain it, control it, and ultimately discredit it. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had revealed the extent of their influence by their very ability to arrange this meeting. Jasmine now knew that the corruption network reached into the House Ethics Committee itself, which meant that some of the people trying to stop her investigation were themselves part of the conspiracy she was investigating. Jasmine realized that working within the system would not be enough. The corruption network had too much influence within official channels to allow a fair investigation to proceed. If she wanted to expose the truth, she would have to take her evidence directly to the American people. She began by reaching out to investigative journalists at major news organizations, providing them with carefully selected documents that told part of the story, while protecting her sources and preserving the most damaging evidence for maximum impact. The first story appeared in the Washington Post on a Tuesday morning, detailing previously unreported financial relationships between Justice Thomas and wealthy donors. The response was immediate and intense. Conservative media outlets attacked the story as a partisan hit job. Liberal commentators demanded immediate investigations. Legal experts debated the implications for the Supreme Court's legitimacy. But most importantly, the story established the credibility of the investigation and created public demand for more information. Over the next 2 weeks, Jasmine coordinated the release of additional evidence through multiple news outlets. Each story revealed new aspects of the corruption network, building a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse of power at the highest levels of government. The public reaction was overwhelming. Polling showed that trust in the Supreme Court had dropped to historic lows. Protesters gathered outside the court demanding justice. Members of Congress from both parties began calling for investigations. But the most significant response came from within the corruption network itself. Faced with mounting public pressure and the prospect of criminal investigations, several lower-level participants began reaching out to Jasmine's team, offering to cooperate in exchange for leniency. These whistleblowers provided even more evidence, including recorded conversations, internal documents, and detailed accounts of how the corruption scheme operated. The tipping point came when a former clerk to Justice Thomas provided Jasmine with recordings of conversations in which Thomas explicitly discussed how his financial relationships with donors influenced his judicial decisions. The recordings were devastating, not just because of what they revealed about Thomas, but because they mentioned other justices and senators who were part of the same network. The moment Jasmine had been building toward came on a Thursday morning in March, when she requested time to address the House of Representatives on a matter of urgent national importance. Speaker Johnson, under intense pressure from both parties, granted her request, though he limited her to 30 minutes and required that she submit her evidence to the House Counsel in advance. The House chamber was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, members stood along the walls, and the press gallery overflowed with reporters from around the world. The C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as Jasmine walked to the podium, carrying with her a thick binder that contained the evidence of the largest corruption scandal in American history. "Mr. Speaker, members of the House, fellow Americans," she began, her voice calm but carrying clearly through the chamber. "I stand before you today to present evidence of systematic corruption that reaches the highest levels of our government and threatens the very foundation of our democracy." She opened her binder and pulled out the first document, a comprehensive financial analysis showing the flow of money from billionaire donors to Supreme Court justices. The numbers were staggering. Over $50 million in unreported gifts, payments, and benefits had flowed to 3 sitting Supreme Court justices over the past 15 years. Justice Clarence Thomas alone received over $4.2 million in unreported benefits from billionaire donors who had direct financial interests in cases before the Supreme Court, Jasmine continued. Justice Samuel Alito received $1.8 million in similar benefits. Justice Neil Gorsuch received $900,000. But the Supreme Court corruption was just the beginning. Jasmine's investigation had revealed that the same network of donors had also purchased influence with 12 senators and over 30 representatives. The total amount of unreported influence money exceeded $50 million, making it the largest corruption scandal in American history. "This is not a partisan issue," Jasmine emphasized. "The corruption crosses party lines and involves both Democratic and Republican officials. What unites these officials is not ideology, but greed, the willingness to sell their votes and their decisions to the highest bidder." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Bank records, recorded conversations, witness testimony, and documented correlations between payments and official decisions painted a picture of corruption so extensive and systematic that it amounted to the purchase of the American government by a small group of billionaires. But Jasmine had saved the most devastating evidence for last. She pulled out a small digital audio player and placed it on the podium. The chamber fell silent as she prepared to play recordings that would destroy careers and potentially trigger criminal prosecutions. What you are about to hear, she said, is a recording of a conversation between Justice Clarence Thomas and donor Harlan Crow, made during a private meeting at Crow's Ranch in East Texas. The conversation took place 3 days before the Supreme Court agreed to hear a case involving environmental regulations that directly affected Crow's business interests. She pressed play, and Justice Thomas's voice filled the chamber. "Harlan, I want to thank you again for everything you've done for Guinea and me. The trips, the house for my mother, the school tuition for my nephew. It means more than you know." "Of course, Clarence. That's what friends do for each other. I want you to know that I'm very aware of your concerns about the environmental case coming up. I can't make any promises about how I'll vote, but I can tell you that I understand the broader implications for business interests like yours. I appreciate that, Clarence. Sometimes the court needs to remember that excessive regulation can destroy American competitiveness." "I couldn't agree more. And I think you'll find that my colleagues are increasingly sympathetic to that perspective, especially given the support that people like you provide to organizations that educate the public about these issues." The recording continued for several more minutes, with Thomas explicitly connecting his financial relationship with Crow to his judicial philosophy and hinting that other justices were similarly influenced by their donor relationships. The reaction in the chamber was immediate and visceral. Several members audibly gasped. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The press gallery erupted in whispered conversations as reporters frantically typed on their phones and laptops. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She played additional recordings involving other justices and senators, each one more damaging than the last. The evidence was so comprehensive and so damning that it was impossible to dismiss or explain away. The response to Jasmine's presentation was swift and seismic. Within hours, protests erupted outside the Supreme Court building. Legal scholars called for the immediate impeachment of the corrupt justices. Editorial boards across the country demanded investigations and prosecutions. But the most significant response came from within the government itself. The Justice Department, under intense public pressure, announced that it was opening criminal investigations into the corruption allegations. The House Judiciary Committee voted to begin impeachment proceedings against the implicated justices. The Senate Ethics Committee launched its own investigation into the senators who had been named in the scandal. Justice Clarence Thomas, faced with overwhelming evidence of his corruption and the prospect of criminal prosecution, announced his resignation from the Supreme Court effective immediately. In a brief statement, he cited health concerns and a desire to spend more time with family. But everyone understood the real reason. He had been caught, and there was no way to defend the indefensible. Justice Alito followed suit within 48 hours, also announcing his resignation. Justice Gorsuch initially tried to fight the allegations, but the evidence against him was so overwhelming that he too resigned within a week. The senators implicated in the scandal faced similar consequences. 3 announced their resignations immediately. Others faced censure from their colleagues and certain defeat in their next elections. The entire network of corruption that had operated with impunity for over a decade crumbled in a matter of weeks. The corruption scandal triggered the most comprehensive ethics reforms in American history. Congress passed the Judicial Accountability Act, which established strict disclosure requirements for all federal judges and created an independent inspector general to investigate ethics violations. The Supreme Court Ethics and Transparency Act required the court to adopt the same ethics rules that apply to all other federal judges. Campaign finance laws were strengthened to close the loopholes that had allowed wealthy donors to purchase influence through charitable donations and speaking fees. New regulations required real-time disclosure of all gifts and benefits to federal officials, regardless of their source or stated purpose. But perhaps most importantly, the scandal changed the public's understanding of how corruption operates in American politics. Citizens became more aware of the subtle ways that wealthy interests purchase influence, and they demanded greater transparency and accountability from their elected officials. Jasmine Crockett became a national hero, but she remained focused on the work of reform rather than basking in the attention. She used her newfound influence to push for additional anti-corruption measures and to support investigations into other areas of government where similar abuses might be occurring. The victory came at a significant personal cost for Jasmine. She received death threats from extremists who viewed her investigation as an attack on conservative institutions. Her family required constant security protection. Her personal life was scrutinized and attacked by partisan media outlets. But she also received overwhelming support from ordinary Americans who were grateful that someone had finally held powerful officials accountable for their corruption. Letters poured in from across the country thanking her for her courage and dedication to justice. The investigation had consumed 3 years of her life and required enormous personal sacrifices. But when she looked at the reforms that had been implemented and the corrupt officials who had been removed from power, she knew that the sacrifice had been worth it. "Sometimes," she said in an interview after the scandal had concluded, "the system won't police itself. Sometimes it takes someone from outside the established power structure to shine a light on the corruption and demand accountability. I'm proud that I was able to play that role, but I'm even more proud of the American people who demanded change once they saw the evidence." As the initial shock of the revelations wore off, Jasmine's investigation continued to yield new discoveries. The financial forensics team had uncovered additional layers of the corruption network that extended far beyond the initial 3 Supreme Court justices and 12 senators. Federal judges across the country had received similar benefits from the same network of donors. State Supreme Court justices had been purchased to ensure favorable rulings in cases that could eventually reach the federal level. Even some federal prosecutors had been compromised through targeted donations to their preferred charities and professional organizations. The scope was breathtaking. What had initially appeared to be isolated corruption by individual officials was revealed to be a comprehensive assault on the American justice system by a coordinated network of billionaires who had essentially purchased their own private court system. The investigation revealed that the network had been operating for over 20 years, carefully selecting and grooming judicial candidates from law school through their entire careers. They had funded law school scholarships for promising conservative students, provided clerkship opportunities with friendly judges, and created a pipeline of loyal jurists who understood that their career advancement depended on serving the interests of their wealthy patrons. One of the most shocking discoveries was the Justice Fund, a $200 million pool of money controlled by Leonard Leo and other conservative activists that had been used to provide luxury benefits to Supreme Court justices and their families. The fund had paid for private school tuition for justices' children, luxury vacations for their spouses, and even home renovations and medical expenses. The fund operated through a complex network of shell companies and charitable organizations that made it nearly impossible to trace the money back to its original sources. But Jasmine's team had cracked the code, following financial transactions across multiple jurisdictions and corporate structures to reveal the true scope of the operation. The corruption network's influence wasn't limited to American institutions. Jasmine's investigation revealed that the same billionaires had been using similar tactics to influence foreign courts and governments, particularly in countries where they had significant business interests. Shell companies linked to Harlan Crow had made payments to judges in several European countries who were hearing cases involving American corporate interests. The Koch network had funded judicial education programs in developing countries where they were seeking to expand their oil and gas operations. The revelation that American billionaires were exporting their corruption tactics to other countries created a diplomatic crisis. Several allied nations demanded explanations from the U.S. government and threatened to investigate American business operations in their countries. The international scandal also revealed the global nature of the threat to democratic institutions. Wealthy individuals and corporations weren't just corrupting American democracy, they were using similar tactics to undermine democratic governance around the world. This realization led to coordinated international efforts to combat judicial corruption and strengthen democratic institutions. The United Nations adopted new anti-corruption protocols specifically targeting judicial independence. The European Union implemented stricter disclosure requirements for judges and prosecutors. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Jasmine's investigation was the cultural shift it created in American attitudes toward wealth, power, and corruption. The detailed exposure of how billionaires had purchased the justice system awakened many Americans to the reality that their democracy was under attack from within. Public opinion polling showed dramatic changes in how Americans viewed the Supreme Court, with trust in the institution falling to historic lows. But more broadly, Americans became more skeptical of concentrated wealth and more supportive of measures to limit the political influence of billionaires. The scandal sparked a renaissance in investigative journalism, as news organizations realized that there was both public demand and civic necessity for deeper investigations into political corruption. Journalism schools reported increased enrollment in investigative reporting programs. Foundations increased funding for investigative projects. Young people, in particular, were inspired by Jasmine's example to pursue careers in public service and accountability journalism. Law school applications surged, with many applicants citing the corruption scandal as their motivation for wanting to work within the justice system to prevent similar abuses. While the immediate corruption network had been dismantled, Jasmine knew that the battle for clean government was far from over. Wealthy interests would adapt their tactics, find new loopholes, and attempt to rebuild their influence networks through different mechanisms. Her office became a clearinghouse for tips and information about potential new corruption schemes. Whistleblowers from across the government reached out with evidence of other abuses of power. The investigation that had started with a single photograph of a yacht had evolved into a permanent watchdog operation. New challenges emerged as corrupt officials and their benefactors fought back through legal challenges, political pressure, and personal attacks. Several of the implicated billionaires funded legal challenges to the ethics reforms, arguing that they violated free speech rights and interfered with legitimate business activities. The resistance was well-funded and sophisticated, but it faced a new reality, an awakened public that was no longer willing to tolerate corruption at the highest levels of government. Every attempt to roll back the reforms was met with public outcry and political consequences. 5 years after Jasmine Crockett first saw that photograph of Justice Thomas on Harlan Crow's yacht, the American political system had been fundamentally transformed. The Supreme Court operated under strict ethics rules that required transparency and accountability. Federal judges faced regular oversight and could be removed for ethics violations. Campaign finance laws had been strengthened to prevent the kind of influence buying that had corrupted the justice system. But perhaps most importantly, the American people had learned that democracy requires constant vigilance and that corruption can only flourish in darkness. The detailed exposure of the $50 million corruption network had shown citizens exactly how their government could be purchased and manipulated by wealthy interests. Jasmine had proven that one person with courage, determination, and access to the facts could take on the most powerful corruption network in American history and win. Her investigation had not only removed corrupt officials from power, but it also created lasting reforms that would protect democratic institutions for generations to come. The yacht photograph that had started it all was now displayed in Jasmine's office, not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that corruption often hides in plain sight, that powerful people believe they are above accountability, and that sometimes it takes just one person willing to ask hard questions to bring down an entire network of abuse. Committee rooms across the Capitol now operate under new rules that Jasmine helped to write. Ethics disclosure requirements are stricter, financial transparency is mandatory, and the American people have tools to hold their representatives accountable in ways that were unimaginable before the great corruption scandal of the 2020s. Jasmine Crockett's name is now mentioned alongside other transformative figures in American history. People who saw injustice and refused to look away, who faced overwhelming power and refused to back down, who understood that democracy is not a spectator sport, but requires active participation from citizens willing to fight for what's right. The $50 million corruption network is gone, but the vigilance it taught remains. Every time a public official accepts a gift, every time a judge makes a decision, every time a senator casts a vote, the American people are watching with new eyes and new understanding of how corruption operates. The price of justice turned out to be eternal vigilance, but it was a price that America was finally willing to pay. And it all started with one congresswoman who looked at a photograph of powerful men on a yacht and asked the simple question, who paid for this trip? Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. One person willing to ask the questions that powerful people don't want answered. Jasmine Crockett asked those questions, found the answers, and gave them to the American people. What they did with those answers changed everything. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.